Trina, great to see you. What were some of the concerns you had with the coverage of yesterday's launch of the treaty fishery?
Yeah, you know, it's always the wording in the stories around the fishery. I'm reading a story. Someone had posted it on Facebook, and they had called out the wording of the treaty fisheries as the so-called treaty fishery licenses for boats. Right? So it's this use of the word so-called. Like, in journalism, you know, we have to be so careful with our words, and the use of that word makes it seem like the treaty fishery licenses aren't valid or legitimate. It's kind of like putting air quotes around something. And so it just stood out as such blatant. To me, it just reveals the bias. And we went through this last year, and now a year later to be reading journalism and reading that kind of language used in a story this year, a year later, it was kind of frustrating.
Like you say, this isn't something new. I remember many times when you worked here at APTN News where this was an issue that you would raise. But what harm is done when using this kind of language?
It really, it delegitimizes the Mi'kmaq treaty rights, right? So a lot of the language, that we're reading in the stories, even this year. So it's an unauthorized fishery, right? So meaning it's not following DFO rules. Last year, the word was we kept calling it an unregulated fishery, and I haven't really read that word yet. I've read self-regulated, which is true. It's not an unregulated fishery. The Mi'kmaq have regulations. Sabaganagati has regulations. Other bands that are fishing, my band, Glooscap, is developing regulations to start its own treaty fishery. So there are regulations. But when you're always saying unauthorized, or outside of the season, I'm still reading that, so always putting the Mi'kmaq outside of the rules as if they're doing something wrong. We saw that last year, and we still see it this year. Some of the coverage is a bit better, but some of it's not, right? Some of it, you're still seeing that language used. And I'm like, man, we're in year 2. This isn't, and I've said this before, this isn't even a story about lobster. It's not a story about fishing. It's a story about how Canada handles treaty rights, how they handle Indigenous rights. And they don't do it very well. And the fisheries issue here just highlights that. But, in round 2, we shouldn't just be reporting events. I mean, obviously we have to report events, but we should be doing deeper analysis and deeper questioning of Canada and of DFO, saying how come? Why is this an unauthorized fishery in your eyes? Why haven't you done the work to implement some sort of respect for the treaty fishery within DFO regulations? And that's the question. That should be the headline. But that's not what you see. You see unauthorized fishery, or Sack got arrested. Obviously, that's a headline. But the language is just really damaging to the narrative of sort of what's happening on the ground.
Trina, as someone who is Mi'kmaq and spent years covering the treaty fishery and who's now a professor of journalism, what is your advice for those covering this story?
Do your homework. First of all, do your homework so that you understand, and this is year 2, so all the reporters now who are covering this have had time to understand the Marshall decision, understand what the treaties, understand the Mi'kmaq history here. So so you're walking in and you can make sense of the situation in a better way. So that's the first thing, is do your homework. Watch your wording, because when we're calling it a dispute, some wording, it actually makes it inaccurate, right? So some wording, like a dispute is kind of like two people, or I've heard it called a clash, they're clashing. Well, that's like 2 equal sides, and that's not what's happening, right? You have a small group of Mi'kmaq who are fishing, and last year you had a huge mob of protesters, right? And that's not a dispute. So really describing what's happening accurately, providing the context, and using active language, because one of the other things I read was a lobster pound. I just read it this morning. A lobster pound was scorched last year, and I'm like, well, that's not even accurate. Somebody scorched it. So active writing, right? In journalism, it's much more accurate when you say when you use active writing, because there was somebody charged in that, so we know who scorched the building. We can say it, and then finally, just making sure that you're focused on sort of the real story at this point, the real question of why the rights aren't being implemented, and that you understand the facts. The Mi'kmaq have treaty right. That's a fact. That the Marshall decision upheld those rights. That they didn't grant the rights. That's a fact. And so we don't have to attribute. As journalists, we attribute things that are emotion or opinion. He says he has treaty rights. Well, no, we can just say Chief Sack has treaty rights. The Mi'kmaq have treaty rights, and so we can just give that the validity that it deserves. And so that would be my journalism lesson on how to report well on the fisheries.
Well, Professor Roache, it's great to see you and great to have you with us. Appreciate you taking some time for us.
Thank you, Walal and Dennis.